Steve Govett. This is the TFL Podcast. We're back with episode 16. I say this every week because I'm so excited by the people and groups that I have on, and I say they're special, but those guys have never been special. These two guys are really most special. Next week, it'll be somebody more special than them, but these guys are super special and really hold a significant place in my heart. I want to introduce two guys that really brought me into the pro game as friends and teammates and my coach, and we've evolved those relationships over the past 25 to 30 years now. But Chris Bates, head coach of the Archers, former head coach of Princeton University and Drexel University, and now at Episcopal Academy in Philadelphia. Chris Bates, welcome to the TFL Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
The illustrious Tony Resch joins us as well, Hall of Fame National Lacrosse League coach, right up there with the great Les Bartley and a number of other people. But Tony Resch, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. I've been waiting by my phone for quite a while, so I'm quite happy to finally be here.
I would say by popular demand, I had to reach out to you guys and make sure that I got you on the show. I want, just to start off and set the tone for the show, by show of hands, how many people on this Zoomcast have been locked in a bus bathroom driving back from New York?
This is where we're starting, huh?
We're going to start right there.
I like it. All right.
Right out of the box. You didn't put your hand up. Yes, there we go. Yes, because it wasn't the two of us.
Coach Bates has his hand up. Yes, indeed.
And what you missed while you were in the bathroom was Johnny Nostrand up at the front of the bus on a microphone similar to this, talking about the hair on the back of his wife. Do you don't remember, Batesy, but obviously Tony was at the front of the bus watching the whole thing. Gina, you got hair on your back. What are you doing? And Gina was sitting right next to him.
Nody's performances on those return trips from New York are when you are thankful there were no cell phones and video capabilities, because he would have had a hard time working around those.
Nody wouldn't have been at Haverford for as long as he was if that had been the case.
That is true.
Fellas, it's, like I said, pleasure to have you. And obviously, Batesy, I want to get into, you and I met before we actually were teammates on the Wings, because you spent a season with Dallas Elliott with the Burnaby Lakers before I tried out for the Wings, and we became friends there. And there's a great concussion story that we'll get to later for you playing with the Burnaby Lakers in the WLA and your first experience in box lacrosse in Canada. But Batesy, who put the stick in your hand for the first time? How did you start down the road before John Jay? How did you get into playing a little bit of lacrosse?
I was the typical multi-sport guy, but, I kind of like to bump into people, and, lacrosse just seemed like the natural fit. I remember a handful of coaches. Well, for those, I'm a 5'8" dude, so basketball was never going to be the future. And I remember being at a basketball camp and a guy saying to me, "You should really play lacrosse." I was usually playing basketball. I was usually in foul trouble by halftime. I didn't agree with the refs even then, typically with calls. But a guy by the name of Peter Pagnucco, who ultimately went to Lafayette. Both my parents worked at John Jay High School, and I remember having a catch in my back lawn. He just came over, brought two sticks, and it just seemed to be a natural fit for me for a variety of reasons. So I still stay in touch with Peter, which is fun. But, I couldn't hit a curveball. It's all the same old stories, right? I couldn't hit a curveball.
Small strike zone. T-Resch, how did you get in the game? Because I know your brother played a pivotal role in that, and he was a little older. But how did you get into the game?
So again, I'm older than you guys, so it was my neck of the woods. It was football, basketball, baseball, and that was all anybody played. I was very fortunate that I have 5 older siblings, 3 older brothers, and they went to Penn Charter. It's a private school in Philadelphia that fortunately just happened to have a lacrosse team. There were really not many schools that even had lacrosse, certainly no youth league. So I just kind of picked it up watching my brothers, their broken stick in the corner and, of the house. And but until I got to ninth grade, I never really played any semblance of organized lacrosse. So I came to it late. Same thing. Failed baseball player, was pretty much the standard guy playing lacrosse in those days. But yeah, so my older brothers, I would go as a spectator and just running around on the sidelines, picking up sticks, and yeah, that's kind of through osmosis, I guess you would say.
So you end up being a long pole, but ultimately you don't end up a goalie. As the youngest of all the brothers, you don't end up a goalie.
Yeah, that's usually how it works. But in those days, there wasn't enough lacrosse around that they were busy in the backyard. You're always kind of just in that season playing lacrosse, and then it was ready for, summer was everything, and then football and basketball, and then back to lacrosse. So the kind of pummeling, and it was whatever the season that was going on at that time, I got pummeled in. So it was not necessarily always in the goal.
And it's true, you're not the best athlete in your marriage, right? Is that true?
That is correct.
That is a correct statement, right?
My better half. I'm huge, not a great basketball player, but I love the sport. My wife, Mary, scored 1,000 points in high school, 4-year starter at Yale, captain. So yes, she clearly is.
Total stud.
Yeah, you quickly admitted that. So I think you should score points for this.
Yes.
Definite. And your son, not a bad player either.
Yeah.
Patrick's having a pretty good run as a pro. When's he going to play indoor?
He's been dabbling with the Wings, actually, and he's been sort of practice squad. He played a couple games right at the end of the season 2 seasons ago, and
the Wings have been dabbling since we all left. So,
yeah, I mean, he loves it. He loves the guys. He really likes the coaching staff. They of course have a great pipeline from up north. So yeah, for a guy who would be a transition or a defender, he's up against some really good guys. So
we need some Dartmouth guys in the league, Steve. See what you can do about that.
Some Dartmouth guys. Hey,
so Tony, you walked into the locker room with the Wings as first time as an MILL player. What are your impressions? That you don't necessarily walk into a locker room. I remember, practicing in Mickleton, there was no locker rooms, and it was just an odd experience for a Canadian who came in, no showers, no, I'm going to drive 3 hours home and I stunk, but whatever. What was it like for you stepping in to play for the Wings kind of in the early 90s?
Yeah, it was, I guess I would say, and maybe another way to answer who put a stick in my hand in the indoor version, it would certainly be Mike French, who was good friends with my older brother Hank, and they played lacrosse and basketball in local leagues. So when the Wings started up, I was actually not in the area right the first season. So saw Mike in the off season, and he invited me to try out. I literally was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've been to one game at the Spectrum, I think when I was like 10 years old, in that first version when, Doug Favell was a Flyers player, but was all, he was like the Blaze Reardon of his time. So that was the only fights. And so I really knew nothing about it, but having just watched a little bit in that first season, I was like, I'd love to try it. And so we showed up, and we actually practiced in Maryland our first few years because most of the guys were coming from Baltimore. John Tucker and Brad Kotz lived down there. And so literally walked in. I didn't even know the Philadelphia guys. I didn't know Gary Martin that well, a little bit of club with those guys. So it was talk about just being thrown into the fire. But to me, the key figure outside of Mike French is Dave Evans. At that point, it was almost all Americans, just learning on the fly. And we had the huge advantage of having Dave coming in from Vancouver. And again, I had no idea who Dave was or anything else, but I think we got that actual coaching of what is box lacrosse supposed to look like. I think that was such a huge first step for us in those early years, and we found some success relatively quickly.
Dave Evans, who gets little credit for being one of the biggest pioneers in the Major Indoor Lacrosse League and the National Lacrosse League, and has spent some time with the Vancouver Ravens when they were around, and then ultimately the Stealth. But man, he was an icon in Philly from the Philadelphia Wings perspective. And I do remember him going back, because he's a Burnaby guy. He was a goalie in Burnaby. I remember him going back, and he would always be the MC at all the events for Burnaby Junior Lacrosse. And he would talk about this league that people were playing in. And then, I ultimately got connected with guys like Kevin Alexander and a few others that would talk about the circus that this league was and and playing in this. And I said to myself, I've got to find a way to make this happen. And then ultimately seeing it on TV and watching, Detroit play and Gary and Paul and those guys. And then the dream come true. And Batesy, as we walk into a locker room, with Tony as a coach, and I think you did it the year before, but talk about your experience walking in there.
Well, I played for Dave Evans too. So, and interesting enough, I still have his playbook that we used back in 1990. I've saved it and just, it feels like a relic, but just the personalities you walk in and again, being in Mickleton and watching guys change in the corner, you're like, this is professional. This is
pro.
Yeah, this is
Mickleton was pretty nice compared
but then, the competitive, once the ball drops, then you're like, okay, this is the real deal. Like these are serious competitors who are fighting for a job and fighting essentially for a paycheck. So, I felt lucky. It took me a couple of years to crack the lineup. Actually, after going to Burnaby's, when I became much more kind of a fixture. And early on, just, I remember Mike Page, the Penn guy, my first tryout, like, he's like, no, you pick one hand and stay on that. I had never seen it. I had a little axe because I didn't, I couldn't even get a try. I was living in New York City. I couldn't get a tryout for the Saints. I played club with all those guys, and I bumped in on Manhattan Street to John Nugent, who was trying out for Philly. He was originally from Philly, and Frenchie, I FedExed a lacrosse resume to Frenchie. He's like, if you're crazy enough to come down here and want to travel, have at it. We'll at least give you a shot. And sure enough, that's kind of where it started. But
Steve, you'll remember the story.
Can I just jump in real quick with speaking of Dave Evans? So I don't keep archives or anything, but I did find this one file. So here is, I don't know if you guys can see this. Speaking of Dave Evans, this should be like the Wings way, because he hand wrote that long ago, all the drills, some plays, and this is basically when I started coaching, this is all I had. I had 6 years of playing experience as mostly a D guy, and this was like my Bible. So in a lot of ways, this is because I just stole everything he did, added a little bit as we went along, and different coaches came in and were awesome. But it was when I came across this, I was like, wow, this is like a true artifact of what the Wings were founded on.
Tony, you remember the great versatility, and I still tell this story. You could tell Batesy, you got to be a lefty today. Batesy, you got to be a righty today. This game you're playing righty. And Batesy would be like, okay. He freaking put a stick in his left hand. I had never seen it before. I didn't know. I'm like, what are you talking about? That guy's good. He's a righty today. What are you talking about? And it was amazing. But Batesy was the most versatile player on the team. But Chris, talk about the experience in Burnaby, because you got this conky. Back in the day, we just called it your bell was rung, and you just kept playing. And I don't think you remembered most of that summer after that.
No, that was – I learned a lot, let's just say. And there were some trials and tribulations. I remember the one game where I was going to Vail the next day or 2 days later, and we were in – I forget what arena we were in. And I looked out, and I realized that there were 4 other dudes that were my size. And I'm like, all right, here it comes. Like, this is my come to understanding what this is about, because there was nobody to protect me. Like, there was no – and, my game offensively was I just have to keep moving, because if you catch me, I'm in trouble, because I was 175 pounds soaking wet. But, yeah, that one game, you tried at some point to protect me, but I got one square between the eyes. And the embarrassing thing was I had the muskrat double black eyes for like a week. I'm like, I can take it in punch, but I got to look like an ass for 2 weeks. But I remember, what was his name? Lindsey Moffitt? Is that
Eric Moffitt?
Whatever his first name, Moffitt.
Derek Moffitt.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I remember walking in between periods, and he was my, one of my buddies on the team. And I remember looking at him. I'm like, I have no idea where my locker is. Like, I wasn't going to tell anybody because I wanted to keep playing, but I'm like, just show me, like, I'm put my big toe, and I'm like, I don't know where to go at this point. So I knew I had a bit of an issue at that point. And
Derek Moffitt went on the Ricky Lake show. ended up, this is like, you know, the old shows where you separate your girlfriend and he went on this show with this girlfriend, Ricky Lake, and he is not the father. I just want you to know that was the conclusion of the show. Resch, we had a tryout. Steve Govett shows up for the first tryout and to set the stage because you were the coach of the team. You're the head coach, but you didn't get the credit for the head coach because Mike French had to be the head coach on paper, but never showed up to a single event except for the party at the Radnor Hotel. So, but coaching-wise, you start your career as you're a coach, not coach.
Correct. And the whole thing, I can't remember the exact timeline, but Mike Page, Bates, you mentioned him earlier, was the assistant coach, obvious heir apparent. And then for family reasons, I think his wife got a great opportunity outside the area. All of a sudden, we were coachless. I was planning on, I thought I had one more year in me. And then suddenly, I guess it was Mike came to me eventually and said, what do you think about coaching? And again, you know, playing's better, more fun, but I thought, oh, it's an opportunity to stay involved with the team a little bit longer. But then the league told him, like, there's no way we're going to look like the most rinky-dink league ever. I'm like,
yeah, because that was the only thing to make them look rinky-dink.
I was like, that's all you're worried about? So they said, okay, we're going to name Mike the head coach. And quite honestly, Mike, right from the get-go, was like, yeah, I'm not going to be I'll give you my 2 cents here and there, but you'll be in charge. So GT came on to help out. And so from all intents and purposes, I was the coach from day one, although officially I was not. Mike French was our championship coach.
Steve Govett shows up first day of camp, and I've never asked this question of a guest, talk about my game, because I know what's coming. But it was the greatest thing. You had 2 weekends to make the team. You had basically 4 practices. You showed up, and it was like, okay, have at it. And your style was literally you rolled the ball out and said, okay, make the team.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And you just wanted to see guys play.
Well, I would term that as I wanted to see the competitive side of every guy. Right. I was not a walkthrough guy. I was not that was how we were raised too. We learned on the job. We learned at 1 practice a week throughout my career. So it's kind of what I knew was to let guys scrap as much as they could, give them as many competitive situations as we could, and see which guys continued to kind of show their toughness and skill. So, and I will say, Steve, I've heard you in other telecasts sort of teasing yourself, but that's what a great job our coaching staff did. You were kind of a skill guy for us. Which kind of shows how we were filling in with
we must have sucked.
That's what I'm saying.
You must have been thin on the skill.
That's what I'm saying. And we won with you as a skill guy. So
if anybody wants a second opinion.
Batesy, I literally showed up at your house, and I forget where you lived, but it was this big giant house, and big old giant house, and I ended up staying the night because, God forbid you get a hotel room or something, and they literally, it was like, yeah, you show up, here's when the tryouts are, and I get the letter, and I'm all excited. I'm showing up. Mike French invites me to come out, and and I stayed at your place for 2 weekends in a row, and man, I thought it was the greatest thing in the world. We get to play here.
Yeah. So, Steve, I've always wondered about the timing of that. So when Dave was running the show, because he was out here and he worked when he got back home, he was a bit of a mother hen, driving the guys around and taking care of the guys. So did you, I remember telling Dallas specifically, like, I am not picking you up, taking you anywhere. So
you don't want to do that with Dallas.
But did you guys
who knows where you're going to pick Dallas up from? That was the problem.
Right. Did you
guys never lived with Dallas, so if you want to go there, I got a story or two for that.
Listen, I played, my illustrious college career at Radford University, where they dropped the program, so my records will never be broken. It's actually a perfect scenario for me. Thanks. It's like legendary status. This is how you get to be a TFL. So the whole point of this is I reached out, and as I was at Radford, I had a buddy that went to Herkimer and then came down. And so he was all into lacrosse, and we drove up in one of the teammates' cars, and we went up to a game in Philly at the Spectrum, and Dave Evans had gotten me tickets, and I sat up, and this is like 92, 91, 92, and we sat way up in the nosebleeds in the Spectrum, and the place is jam-packed. And, the cheesesteaks and the whole thing, right? And, I'm a dumb Canadian kid from, going to school in Virginia. I go to the big city, and we're in Philly, and there's cheesesteaks, and then there's 16,000 people. And I distinctly remember it was either Lou Delegati or Chris Flynn getting a scuffle in the corner, and the turf came off the ice. And, these guys are literally fighting each other on the ice because the turf had folded over, and, they're standing on the ice taking swings at each other. And they're playing the Pittsburgh Bulls, and I knew a few guys on the Bulls, and Brian Nicola and John Wilson were on there. And so, I had known these people, and I'm like, man, I can play here. I play with these guys and against these guys, so I can play with these guys. And there was just that kind of level of circus nature that I was like, man, this is all me. And so 2 years later, I'm trying to find a way. I'm reaching out to Dallas, and I know Gary and Paul, and I need to get on this team. And so Dallas, I guess, goes to bat for me with Frenchie and says, hey, you know what, you got to get this knucklehead on your team. He might help you out a little bit. So anyway, that's how that started. And Batesy had played with Dallas, right, up in Burnaby, and we ended up connecting. And so there was a place for me to flop for a night or two to be able to go to tryouts. So that I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, driving up, 2.5, 3 hours to go to practice. But it was easy on the weekends. Wednesday nights were a little tougher when you used to have to drive home after practice and go to work the next day, and practice ended at 11. And you're driving back 3 hours going to work the next day. I loved every minute of it. I didn't keep many jobs then, but I loved every minute of it.
Yeah, we did the reverse commute. As I said, we started in Edgewood, Maryland. So we would go down there. The Baltimore guys would be laughing at us as we got in the car at 11 o'clock, heading home to the Philadelphia Wings. But it was a blast. And you reminded me with the turf rolling up, the other great early season, they used to move the turf around from venue to venue because each building have its own. So one game in maybe my second year, they forgot to ship the goals. So we used hockey goals, 6x4. So
I remember this story.
And Ted Sawicki, who was an unbelievable goalie. So they actually made it look fairly respectable, although I did score on Ted Sawicki, so.
There you go. Claim to fame.
Nobody knows it was on a 6x4 goal.
On a hockey goal.
Cali BBQ is proud to be an official sponsor of your San Diego Seals. Buy our slow smoked barbecue at any Seals home game or online anytime at www.calibbq.media.
You guys are how many pro guys from Ivy League schools made it into the MILL at the time, your era? Not very many, right? Andy Towers, maybe?
Pretty limited.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say a couple Cornell guys were New York guys, like the Cummings brothers were Saints. But no, it's definitely pretty thin.
Because you guys are all too smart.
John Reese had a couple years maybe with the Saints also.
I have recently spent a lot of time with John Reese. I'm shocked he didn't play more lacrosse in the major indoor lacrosse league because he certainly had a mentality for it.
Oh, he was an unbelievable football player. He was tailor-made. I don't honestly know. He just never quite found his stride, I guess, indoor.
I want you to do something because we're going to cut a clip of this and I'm going to send it to a very special person. Tell me about Joe Tsai as a lacrosse player. And be honest. Yeah, be honest.
He was an excellent teammate. I honestly, again, in those days, you just sort of guys came on the team, and I was, as I said, I started in 9th grade, so it wasn't like I had been playing my whole life. So Joe was a guy that picked it up late, and I don't even know if we had a JV per se, but he was on the team and young guy working hard. So Yeah, I don't know. He wasn't necessarily getting major minutes by any stretch, but he was an awesome guy and great part of the team.
He loves the game, no question. And transitioning to another passion of his, which is the PLL, and you guys had a great run in the bubble over the course of the last few weeks or months. But the Archers had a real shot, came down to a tough game at the end. But I loved your team, man. It was a ton of fun to watch. And how do you think Grant Ament ends up playing box? Can he play indoor lacrosse?
Interesting, right? I mean, I think you look at guys. I remember Ryan Boyle playing for the Wings, and I was always impressed just with Ryan's toughness, right? I mean, he wasn't backing down from anybody, and I'm watching an Archers game last night, and Grant's, I don't know who he's going against. I think it's an Atlas defenseman, but he's, as quick as he is, he wasn't afraid to sort of post up on the island, and you can't teach that vision either, man. Like that's something pretty unique. So he's probably $160 soaking wet.
Yeah.
But you know what? He's a pretty tough kid. I wouldn't put it past him.
He was good. There's a lot of guys I would love to see playing that, obviously from that league. And first of all, I thought you guys did a great job putting that team together, and it was a ton of fun to watch. And certainly, I think everybody in the lacrosse world in the U.S. and Canada for those 2 weeks in July was glued to their televisions and got a pretty intimate understanding of what it means to be a part of what is and is becoming rapidly a great league to play in. And obviously, you guys can attest to a great league to coach in.
Yep. So, Steve, can I ask you a quick question? It's obviously the way I mentioned it a little while ago. It was all Americans for a while, and then over however many years transitioned to what it is now, primarily Canadian. Is there still a place for a larger number of Americans, or do they have to be the right guy? Do they have to be in the right situation? Well, that's always true, I guess, in terms of opportunities. It's been pretty tough, and that's from a distance. I'm obviously not anywhere close to what you are in terms of what rosters up and down look like. Look like.
Look, I think what's interesting right now is the growth of U.S. Boxla, and a lot of kids are starting to play the game and just being comfortable, like you guys said. I think when most guys came into the league, at least in our era, and then maybe subsequently afterwards, I drafted Matt Danowski in the first round. The kid had never been inside an arena in his life, right? And Ned Crotty, same thing. I mean, if you go back and look at some of the guys that were our contemporaries that were they had never seen a box lacrosse game, and going in and playing for the first time. That was their exposure. And when you had 4 practices to figure it out, a guy like Jake Berge figuring out as quickly as he did and taking to it as fast as he did, was an unbelievable thing. But a guy like Jay Gelbert took him a while, right? And he wasn't great when we first drafted him, Tony, and ultimately he turned into a really good player that, his career was was cut short a little bit, and then the, Jamie Hanford, who would have played, for 1,000 years because he liked to shower with all the other guys. But, at the end of the day, Dave Stilley, same thing. So when we talk about kids playing right now, there's a lot of kids that are picking the game up at a much, much younger age level, right? And even my son, who is currently a Delaware player, he's University of Delaware, he's been playing box his whole life. And so when you say multi-sport athlete, I actually started thinking multi-sport athlete when you played outdoor. It was a different skill set than box. And so these kids that are playing both outdoor and box lacrosse, field and box, or whatever the case may be, or whatever you want to call it, they're playing 2 different sports. And so they became multi-sport athletes because the indoor game is a lot like basketball. And so, they're dedicating themselves to a skill set, but they were playing both. So now you see with expansion, I think there's going to be a ton more American players, and more American players are going to have access, but the situation's got to be right, and they've got to dedicate themselves to it because, and I think the opportunities are presenting themselves now, especially with the PLL and the scenario that they're in, the National Lacrosse League that we're in. Ultimately you can see guys starting to make a full-time wage out of playing in both leagues. And that's really going to start to set the stage for kids coming into this game and being able to make a living out of lacrosse. You look at a kid like Trevor Baptiste, right, who is doing all sorts of work and teaching face-offs and teaching kids how to play the game and clearly is a leader on the diversity side of the game. This is a kid that people are watching. He's playing boxing. He's having a great success in boxing, and now he's playing in for the Atlas, and he's having great success there. I think the opportunities are going to start to grow for these guys. So that's me going off on a tangent talking about what I think for the growth of the game, but it's got a lot to do with expansion. And guys like Bob Hamley, who just got the job in Dallas, who's been with 3D in Georgia for a long time, he's a Canadian guy that picked a lot of Canadians to play for his team in Arizona in the early 2000s, but has now transitioned his thought because of his 3D experience and his ability to teach kids in the U.S., now goes to Dallas and will have an eye on a lot of American players. And I can tell you there's a ton of these kids playing in college box leagues that Matt Brown's putting together in Colorado. Oliver Marty, another Brown Ivy League guy that played in the league, but he's in Connecticut, right? And he's doing these things. Andy Towers getting involved with the New England guys the New York Riptide as a scout. I think you're starting to see a blending, if you will, of the days when you guys were involved with us. And it comes to my next question: is the tension between Canadians and Americans as we played Buffalo a number of times and created a great rivalry, but even so much in tryouts and different styles, right? That Tom Marichek, who was on the show a couple weeks ago, talked about how GT Corrigan didn't like him, and he had to sit out the first game because he missed a practice or went to a wedding or something, and GT didn't want him to play. And I was like, yeah, I don't think that's the way it went down, Tommy, but whatever. Anyway, but there was a tension. So talk about that a little bit. Did you guys see that, feel that? How did you navigate that as a coach and then, Chris as a player?
I think early on, just the difference in the game, right? The off ball, what you could do off ball was, still to this day, I'm amazed, right? I think it's been curtailed a little bit, but I have a picture of me, all 5'8" of me, like ready to bang on Peter Park's hip. Right? 'Cause off ball, you could literally just whack the hell out of somebody off ball, right? And for us growing up, you're like, wait, you can't do that. Like
you were a gnat on Peter Park. Peter Park was like 6'6".
He was
huge, giant man. He looked like RoboCop.
But what am I going to do? Wait for him to make it? Like I gotta take the fight to him, right? But
yeah,
the point being, there's just a different mentality, and you guys say it like your flip has to, or your switch has to flip when you get inside because there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide, and it's there's some survival. But I think that the difference is growing up, like you've mentally got to be prepared for that, and I think the natural tension as a result was palpable. Like it just was a different style. So the Americans had to learn it. Go ahead, Tony. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Chris, but I'm going back to I'm going to come to your question in a second. But when you were talking about that sort of how do more Americans get into it, so I'm actually thinking back in time in when you use the term multi-sport athlete. As I think about the guys that were the grinders that we always seem to have an abundance of. They were multi-sport athletes in the true, like they played football, they played basketball. So indoor was in a weird way almost closer. I played football, so I was used to contact. I was used to bump and run. And so in a weird way, that, and I think might almost be a better training for indoor lacrosse along with playing some lacrosse. You know what I mean? Rather than field lacrosse doesn't do a whole lot for you in learning indoor.
I do remember very vividly, and Chris, you may remember this as well, but I remember a huddle at one point in the tryout process with the Wings. And Tony, you said, and I will always remember this, I've used it many, many times. I've told young American players that have come into to training camps for the last 25 years that you can't prepare for a National Lacrosse League training camp by working out, by running on the street. It was like you would have to train in a washing machine, and used to say that you used to have to train in a washing machine to prepare for this. So you better get up to speed pretty quick. Yeah. So
because you can't duplicate those just like Batesy was saying, all those collisions. And the thing I loved about it early on was, and especially as a defenseman in those early days, I'm that old that we ran, you played offense, played defense, and then you came off, that it was constant giving and taking. Like you got blasted on picks, you got to blast people on picks, it was the physicality was just unbelievable. That's why I just, from the get-go, I was like, I can enjoy this in a weird way, with all the
trial process was always
the skill part wasn't happening, so the physical part was enjoyable.
I was going to say the trial process was always, you're taking your life in your hands, because guys that were trying to make the team, who certainly weren't going to put the ball in the back of the net, didn't know the rules. So you're getting gooned by the boards. It was smart. After a little while, Tony would pull you out like, all right, you're like, we don't need to subject you guys to some of the, some of these rookies that are trying
shenanigans.
Yeah. Like, I can name some guys where, you see it in hockey games when somebody takes a run and you're like, that's just nuts. Like, one thing about blowing up a pick, there's another thing about putting your head down and getting blasted from behind into the boards.
Well, the one thing the American guys, I will, you guys talked about it already, but American guys would never take very kindly to a hard pick off ball. And so the D guy would hit you, and then you'd go down and you'd be playing defense, and the offensive guy would start hitting you and cross-checking you. It's like, you can't do that. I can do it to you. You can't do it to me. And so, but Tony, you touched on it a little bit, but there was a core group of guys, and I had Frenchie and Gabes and Raj and those guys. I've had Jalbert and Hanford and I had I had Tommy Marichek and Jake Bergion not too long ago. But there was a core group of guys, and you called them grinders, and we had a name for ourselves, and we took great pride in that grinder. But talk about that core group of guys, because there's a lot of guys that should be recognized in that group. And by the way, we're going to talk about Gabby Rowe trying to hit me with his helmet after a fight in one of those training camp sessions. But I told that story last time.
Yeah.
Talk about the core group.
It's interesting because I go that far back. I mean, you guys are youngsters, but I have a couple team photos that, are around, and even going back to the first two championship games or teams, 89 and 90, right? And you got Gabes and Flinner and Gary Martin, but then there was Steve McGrath and John McGeaney, Mark DeSico, right? So they're the grinders, the other guys, right? You have still needed your John Tuckers and Brad Kotzes, right? So then that's the first couple championships, and Dave was smart enough to always get a Canadian goalie, which was, again, way ahead of his
helpful.
Out of his time. And then when you guys come in, it becomes, Volks and Billy Miller and Batesy and Mack and O'Grady and Rogers and Steve Govett, and right, and that core carries us to two championships, right? And then again, we always had a great goalie. We put the Gates on top of that, the Marichek on top of that, a Kevin Finneran. But those core groups, and then moving forward, you guys all abandoned me for the most part, and now it's Plaza, Stilley, Oglesby, Adam Muir comes in, Peter Jacobs, Tom Slate, Jake Berge arrives then, and I'm really proud of this part. Then we really kind of have to start all over again, and then by some small miracle in 2001, Tom Fair comes in, Dan Radeball, Jay Jalbert, Booger, Tom Ryan, John Gagliardi, right? And we were able to kind of, because the system carried on almost from what we talked about, that being the godfather of the wings, that sort of carried that through. And when we had those really good guys who did all the dirty work and allowed the top guys to do what they did, and always with Dallas or a Dwight in the back doing what they have to do, to me, that was sort of the magic formula.
Does the word
has changed, but
does the word ethos, Chris, for the Philadelphia Wings under Tony, does ethos come to the forefront? And that's the word that I always think of when I think of Tony Resch coaching, is there was an ethos on that team, and that's why it carried through way beyond just the players that played on that team.
No, I think that's well said, and that's the what makes the Wing special, what makes Tony a Hall of Fame coach, right? I mean, I think everybody knew what your role was, right? And if you stepped out of your role, not only a coaching staff almost didn't have to say something, because the leaders of the team were that first line of defense, where if you were 5 minutes late for a practice, Scott Gabrielson's like, hey, sleep at home. The business has started. It's time to go. So the messaging you got very early was, we're here to win this thing. And if you're going to be part of it, you're going to bring something unique. So, but the ethos piece is, number one, you're setting your sights on a championship first and foremost. And whatever that means, whatever role you're going to take, and how that group of guys is going to come together is an ongoing process. But when you start with that as a goal in mind, you fall in line and figure out how you're going to get there. Right?
You think he was a Hall of Fame coach, but do you think he had a Hall of Fame wardrobe on the bench?
You better be careful. Mary's right inside. So what she told me to wear, I wore. So
that's what Danny Stroop always used to say. He goes, he would open his bag when he got on the road in the hotel room to find out what he was wearing.
Yep, absolutely.
I like the Mr. Potato Head tie. I still remember that one.
I like the no tie, button up, flower shirt.
Like champagne from whatever championship. But Steve, I'm sorry to go backwards again, but I do. You guys really brought up a good point, and I mentioned earlier the kind of odd circumstances that even got me the opportunity to coach, because I think back and I'm like, what in the world were they thinking? Because I literally at that point had about 2 years of high school lacrosse coaching. That was my resume, period. So, and I look back, I'm like, did they really just sort of let me? But the huge advantage that I had was that leadership group. You know, it was having Gabe's and Flinner and then new guys like you guys coming in and buying in right away that whatever. I'm sure I had my moments where they were like, what is he going on about? And those guys would say like, it's all right. Just hang in there. Because all I could do was coach the way I thought that, you know, as a player, I was still thinking as a player, right? And we had guys that were all they wanted to do was win and compete, and so it was.
I don't know if I know you remember this, and I told this story the other day. But one of my favorite tactics was 20 guys on the roster, 15 guys played, and 5 guys were sitting out. But that meant you had a group of 5 guys that were a line that were playing in scrimmages and practices, and they knew. Because you posted the roster pre-practice on Wednesday nights, they knew they weren't playing. And literally, they were the hardest working guys, and they were the biggest dicks on the field. If you weren't playing, you were slashing people, you were whacking people. Everybody was trying to make, you know, a place for themselves. You were trying out for the next game. And I thought it was always genius because I sat out a few times and ultimately was like, no, I'm not doing that again. And I would beat the piss out of the guy that was in my spot.
I look back and I feel guilty because we used to have, and Dave did it too, but you guys, just because we had so many guys, they had to learn. When we started playing teams like Buffalo and then later on Toronto, we were so far behind that you guys would just be mauling each other all day, every day, which is why we had so many scraps in practices, because it was just, we had to do it live in order to have any chance once we got to the weekends. So it was.
We also did the one-on-one ground ball in the corner every week. So you're lining
beat
up
the
and like,
piss out of each other.
Flinner would look at me and he knew I was an easy target. Like, all I got to do is say a few words, and then we would have at it, you know, fighting to the death for a ground ball and then running the length of the field and doing a one-on-one. And it was like, the tone is set. Like, this is not a walkthrough. This is go time.
It was one of my favorite drills with the breakaways where you had a chaser. We did it every practice, and it was death on both sides. Because if you didn't catch the guy, you sucked, and if you didn't score, you sucked. So
the guy was pissed off if you caught him and checked him.
Yeah, the whole thing was. I mean, it was pure genius. It just pitted us against each other. Basically, just
John
created.
McAvoy always complained about the full field one-on-ones to this day. He's like, what? Shadow till mid-floor and then maul each other for the rest of the way.
Oh, boy, I did it again. Look at this. We're going long. Another great group. Talking to these guys is fantastic. But check us out next week. You'll get part 2 of Tony Resch and Chris Bates on the TFL podcast. Thanks for joining us.